In this video, a rather special car. I'm here at the Motorist near Leeds to drive this 1972 Ford Escort 1300 XL. And it's not the first time I've driven it either. So we'll get into why this car is so special and how I drove it before. So yeah, this beautiful car finished in this delicious sort of bronze or metallic brown if you're feeling a bit harsh. Is a lovely condition car. 29,000 miles on the clock. Stunningly original condition, and it's the car I picked out of all these here today to drive, even though this MG is lovely. It's a YB and this DKW 1000 estate, just absolutely delicious. 2-stroke 3-cylinder, marvelous. But no, I wanted to drive this car, and there's a few reasons for that. The oldest car of my father's that I remember was a Mk1 Escort, and I featured this car in Classic Car Weekly when I worked on that title, and did a photo shoot with it probably 12 years ago. See, it's XL, so it's got this black panel at the back, just to mark it out as something a bit different than your basic L. Lovely little hubcaps, tiny little wheels, but yeah, an interesting car in its own right, the Ford Escort. It was one of the first joint venture cars for the reunited Ford European operation. So it was Germany working with Great Britain. So previous to this design, Ford Germany and Ford Great Britain operated in different ways and sold different cars. The Cortina was a very UK based operation. Ford Germany had the Taunus and even experimented with front wheel drive. But the Escort was chosen to be a new sort of joint project for the two companies. And a beautiful car it is. The Ford Capri, another one. But I think the first example of their joint working was the Ford Transit. And the Ford Transit especially interesting because they made metric and imperial versions. Metric for Germany, imperial for the UK. But launched in 1968, the Escort was a huge hit. And I think the styling is a large part of that. Got this gorgeous, very late 60s hip kink over the rear, which looks especially good on a 2-door, like this Mexico over here. But for my money, for the family man, the 4-door was a much better bet. Maybe it lost a little in outright style, but made up for it with sheer practicality. Like I say, this example has never been welded. It's got the odd imperfection. There's a few imperfections here on the boot lid, but it's just a great example of a great car. And like I say, 29,000 miles, 20 years with the same owner, who was presumably the owner I met when I featured this car in Classic Car Weekly. Let's have a poke around under the bonnet. So here is the 1300 Kent engine. Longitudinal, it's driving the rear wheels, all very conventional. Ford was a little scared of getting too out there with its ideas, but we have got rack and pinion steering. You can just see a steering rack boot down there. So it was made the car very easy to drive, and these engines didn't chuck out a huge amount of power, but yeah, they were pretty decent for their day. Overhead valves fairly peppy. Moving indoors, we've got plenty of vinyl to torture your legs on hot days. Big steering wheel, 3 spokes, and the Escort logo proudly in the middle. And if I hop in, yeah, it's a nice comfortable place to sit. Bringing you in to sweep across the dashboard. We've got fake wood effect. We've got extra gauges, oil pressure, voltmeter, as well as coolant and fuel level, and even a rev counter. That's what Ford did, is they did a basic package, but then you could spec it up, and the XL, quite funky there. We've got face level ventilation. We've got a Radiomobile radio, various switchgear for lights, heater fan, and the rear wiper. I don't know what this one does. Oh, I think that'll probably be brake warning. It looks like a brake disc, so it must be disc front brakes. So if I press that button, presumably a light somewhere illuminates. Oh, it's screen wash. There we go. It's screen wash. That's not obvious at all. And then we've got the choke control there. Indicator stalk here with a horn. Quite a good horn, it turns out. So we'll play with the wipers in a moment. We've got a cigarette lighter as well, and an extra little warning light there for who knows what. But yeah, it's all very simple but very nicely styled. And here is the car. Despite the fact this is actually Classic Car Buyer, this is a photo I took of this Escort many years ago, and it was reused by Classic Car Buyer, and photos of the engine bay and everything. So yeah, it takes me back. I would love to find the original feature itself, but yeah, it's a nice, comfortable driving position, and Ford were good at doing things like the gear change. It's just delightfully precise and really easy to operate, and it was stuff like that that made these cars so popular against more advanced cars like the BMC 1100, 1300, actually the best-selling car in Britain until the Escort came along, I think. And yeah, despite being so very different with just a conventional rear drive, people loved these cars, and they took to them because they were so easy to drive. You didn't really have to think about it. Here in the rear, it's not too bad at all. I've got a reasonable amount of leg room, and it's spacious enough. I've got opening windows. I've even got ashtrays in the door down here. But yeah, there's not an awful lot to play with back here. It's primarily just seating comfort. Moving into the boot, we can see plenty of space. And oh my gosh, there we go. There is the original magazine, so 2009. We did a classic road test on this Ford Escort Mk1, and I might have to try and find that. And there we go. The feature written by one Ian Seabrook way back in June 2009, which was the last time I saw this car. And I'm not going to read too much because I don't want to know too much about it. I don't want to preempt myself. But yes, January 1968, the Ford Escort Mk1 was launched, and by 1974 they had built 2 million Escorts. But here's another reason why. Lovely spacious boot. We've got a fuel tank possibly this side, and the spare wheel over this side, tucked out of the way. Lots of space, but a typical fairly high lip for cars of this time. Here we go then. Let's start the engine. And it purrs rather gently into life. It's still a little on the cold side, but it sounds lovely. So we'll pull out. Just see the end of the Hubnut social winding up. There's still a few people here. And just need to demonstrate the wipers. And put the wipers on. Oh, there we go. It's a really good wiping pattern actually, good overlap, no triangle of doom. The wipers are a little reluctant to cooperate, but they kicked in eventually, and off we go. The steering it requires a bit of heft to get working, but we're getting there. Put the indicator on, there we go. Oh, brakes need a good shove, but we're away. So there's a little NVH, a little noise, vibration and harshness, but this is what Escorts are about to me. I can't get excited about the sporty Escorts. They're very formidable and can do amazing things, but this is more about what an Escort is. This is the soundtrack of my very earliest years. Riding in my dad's Ford Escort, watching him having to fight the steering that was a bit worn out on his old estate. Yeah, this is lovely. Already sounding a little short of legs at just 40 miles an hour, but that is so typical of cars of this era. So motorway speeds are a bit much. Hard work. You know, the ride's pretty good. We've still got semi-elliptic leaf springs at the back. This is not cutting edge technology in any sense of the word, but yeah, a jolly decent motor vehicle. Steering wheel feels slightly off kilter, like this side is closer to me than this side, and that's probably because I think it actually is, But again, that wasn't very unusual at the time, I guess, to cut down on the number of universal joints. So there's an element of compromise. But this example just feels brand new, basically. It feels untouched. 29,230 miles on the clock, so this won't be one of my longer test drives, because it frankly seems a bit unfair to take this car too far. It has been used so sparingly over the years. There is a fair bit of wind noise going on, despite the fact the quarter lights are no longer opening, so they're not really serving any purpose anymore. I haven't got any external mirrors at all. They weren't a requirement at this time, so there are none. Strange to think that I drove this car 12, 13 years ago. I wouldn't have driven it very far even then, because such is the original condition of this car. I believe this car has just changed hands, or is close to a deal being done. And I'm not surprised. This would be a great car in any personal collection. Just because where do you see cars with so few miles and Mk1 Escorts in such original condition? And these cars were popular with fleet buyers as well, because they were a lot less complicated than the BMC 1100 1300s, the old ADO 16s, even though frankly they're not very complicated at all. But front wheel drive still baffled some people. So Ford swept up the more conservative buyers who they were used to rear wheel drive, they were used to cars being very, very simple, and these really are. But yeah, the handling's really tidy, and it's nothing insane. I think a BMC 1300 is more fun because it's just a bigger Mini. This doesn't handle as well as that, but the steering's still nice and accurate. The controls are nice and light once we're moving, a bit heavy at parking speeds perhaps. It's just, yeah, an absolute pleasure. Speed hump test. Or a little bouncy at the back end there. Those leaf springs, not the best word in refinement. And that's where those ADO 16s score so well, the BMC cars, because of their hydroelastic suspension. They offer a little more refinement, especially over broken ground. Albeit at the cost that suspension can go wrong sometimes. But the cars are greatly misunderstood. But I think the problem with misunderstood cars is they're never going to be popular when those cars are brand new. People don't want to have to understand something, which is why Citroën struggled to sell their cars to a wider market, because you have to understand how they work. There's not very much to understand here. It's just effectively an evolution of Ford's before it. A nice simple overhead valve engine, rear wheel drive, leaf springs, nothing alarming in the slightest. Just got the charge light glowing because the idle seems perhaps just a little too low, but it's so smooth. Feels lovely. Wouldn't be very nice in here on a hot day, but again, that's true of its rivals as well. All this vinyl gets very unpleasant. But cloth interiors tended to be for your plusher models, so an Escort 1300E was worth having. They were quite plush, available in some amazingly lurid paint schemes as well. This was obviously a thing of the time, but these vents can be rotated to direct the air where you want. At the moment they're both aimed up at the windscreen for a bit of extra demisting power. In fact, I think that might be all your demisting power is through those vents. I'm not sure how efficient they would have been. Yeah, this is just an absolutely lovely example of a car that would have been absolutely everywhere in the 1970s, but died out pretty quickly. The four-door saloons, I think, are especially rare because they're exactly the sort of car that just got driven into the ground, and people have always been crazy about two-door Escorts, and they say now of the however many Mexicos were built, there's now about 20,000 more, and I think that's probably applicable. Now, they did rust. That's one reason you don't see them anymore, but it's worth remembering that in context. In the 1970s, pretty much everything rusted. The Austin Allegro, which did overlap with these cars for just the 1 year, tends to have a pretty good record for rust, but yeah, other cars, Vauxhalls, the Japanese imports that were starting to take the country by storm, terrible for rust. But I'm thinking to another rival I drove fairly recently, the Vauxhall Viva. I think the Vauxhall Viva by the 1970s was feeling quite outdated because it was just itself an evolution of earlier Vivas. Whereas the Escort, while it does follow on from other Fords, there's a bit of fresh thinking here. This is a fresh design, albeit using a well-proven overhead valve engine. And I think arguably this is nicer to drive than the equivalent Vauxhall Viva. I like the HB Viva of the 1960s, but I like it in the context of the 1960s. The HC Viva by the 1970s, I think, just felt a little bit dated. This somehow feels a bit fresher. It's in terms of the interior styling, woo, bouncy, and yeah, just the general look and feel. Oh, here we go. So welcome to life for families of this time. Yeah, 60 miles an hour is feeling, it's not feeling hard work, but the engine is turning over a lot of revs. But this was life back then. Most of its competitors would have been the same. Limitations of a 4-speed gearbox and gearing that tended to be more suited for the urban runaround than for going long distance. So motorways were still rather hard working cars at this time. It's worth remembering just how many rivals the Escort had. Front engine front wheel drive cars like the BMC 1100, rear engine cars like the Renault 10 and Volkswagen Beetle, and other front engine rear wheel drive cars like the Vauxhall Viva and some of the Triumph range. Yeah, I'm not sure I'd want to drive too far in this car at 60 miles an hour. I feel I'm asking a lot of this car, which probably hasn't very often seen 60 miles an hour in its life. And the engine's still smooth and it's still sailing along, but I'm not sure you could really call it pleasant. This isn't what this car was really made to do. I love the indicator light though, that's lovely. And the indicator pace is slow and relaxed, but let's pitch her in a bit. And yeah, it steers very nicely. A bit of tyre squeal there. I imagine the tyres are very old. So there we go. Proof that we do not hate Fords on Hubnut. We just like them in a slightly more poverty spec. And yeah, a joyous car to drive, so simple to work on, lovely motor vehicles. Like I say, I think this one has since been sold here at the Motorist, but they have other fine cars you may wish to look at on their website. Also got a cafe here and all sorts. So yeah, thanks to the Motorist for inviting me along. And yeah, it's lovely to be reunited with this car again. You don't often get to see cars you've featured in a magazine, so very nice to catch up with you again. And let's see whether we meet up with it again in the future at some point, who knows. So thank you very much for watching. Don't forget you can head to the Hubnut store and buy lots of lovely merchandise, and I look forward to seeing you in a future video. Farewell.